Hi folks, Scott Wagner, ReachTheRight.com. Happy to give you a little bit of lesson here on philosophy today as it relates to political communications. And I know you've read philosophy. If you're statistically valid, then you've read 30 words, you've read 3 words in 10 books, and each time you open up the book and you go, oh my God, you know, it's 5-syllable words and it's you know, just a bunch of terrible, a little bit of math and symbolic logic and things, and kind of worthless for a human being. But here's the deal with philosophy. Philosophy is the study of the fundamental nature of reality. And great minds, some of our greatest minds, have spent their life doing study of the fundamental nature of reality. And we don't get to ignore that stuff, even though it's really, really difficult to read. And what I'm going to talk about today is one of 3 philosophers that I follow avidly, and he is one that you can actually understand. And that's why I think in some ways he's kind of taken the world by storm, because he's finally got a philosophy that we can use, we people on the ground. And his name is Richard Rorty, recently passed away. But he had a couple of principles I'm going to talk about. I'm going to do, this is the first of 2 videos. The second one is about irony. This one is about pragmatism. Now, Rorty was a pragmatist, and that has a special meaning in philosophy. What it means for them is that they're a special brand of philosopher that kind of looked at everything. They're post-structuralists, which means that they're coming in pretty late in the game, late 20th century, looking around and basically rejecting all philosophical models of reality that encompass mankind. And Rorty was a genius, and he kind of went through a lot of philosophical streams through his whole life and kind of rejected one after the other until he finally came to this notion that, hey, there is no overarching view of reality. There are only contingent models that we can use of reality. Now, the word contingent is important to him, and I'll try not to use it too much because it's a little vague. But here's kind of the basic underpinnings of what he talked about. He had 2 different kinds of models that he talked about for reality. The less important one was the public model. And the public model are overarching facts that have to do, or reality aspects that have to do with a whole bunch of people or 10 people, just more than one person. And it's the lesser form of model, the less important. But you can think about, for instance, in the reality of healthcare, and that's kind of the level that he gets to with models. The UK decided quite a while ago, 50, 60 years ago, that they all valued having healthcare. So they went ahead and used a public model that was a good, and they created a value and an institution that took care of that value. Okay? Now, the other model is more important to him, and that's the private model. And private models are always for a given individual. And what he's trying to say, and he kind of got this from Nietzsche, who did a lot of Superman talk, for those of you that know that. Rorty views everyone's job as to basically work through life and figure out the models of reality that are appropriate for them. Because based on his studies, he discovered that there was so much variability in individuals that it was extremely important on an empirical basis for each person to just kind of work it out. Kind of like the Christian version, where you work out your own salvation. This is the philosophical version of that. Now, I don't know if you can tell where I'm going with this from a political standpoint, but this is essentially an apology, or he's being an apologist for a Jeffersonian liberal kind of approach, all right? This philosophy can work really, really well, particularly with libertarians, because they have almost a magical sense of how important it is for me to be left alone, to have a wide open playing field, be given an enormous amount of freedom in life, because you can't tell me how to live, and that's kind of the sort of rough blue-collar libertarian version of what Rorty said in this philosophy. It's also shared by Democrats because they're socially liberals, so kind of half of what it is that we talk about is addressed really, really well with this fundamental underlying model of reality. Now, I go back to strategy a lot because I was a business consultant. It's really important to have the right strategy. And philosophy is a strategy around reality that says, hey, libertarianism makes a whole lot of sense. And it's really the first one that's come along in philosophy where you can say that kind of a thing, you know, and have good articulation about why that is and so forth. It also, obviously, again, can be used by people like me who are not strictly speaking libertarians, but that have a very high value for the social aspects of freedom. Okay, so that's kind of in a nutshell how pragmatism works. Now, it kind of took the world by a storm when he really started talking about this. Other people did too, but he's probably the foremost pragmatist because he's a great mind and was really able to articulate these things really well. Another aspect of this that fell out of it that's really, really pertinent for me is that he spends a lot of time talking about vocabulary and language because from a philosophical standpoint, you end up, if everybody has their own reality, which is kind of what he's saying, is that, you know, in America there's 300 million people, there's 300 million realities. We end up with kind of, by definition, language, which is really a standardization where we're, in his sense, reaching across realities. Language is can get calcified really easily. And so he spends a lot of time talking about how language is really important. How, for instance, if we don't recognize this about each of us having these radically separate realities, then we're sort of like talking to a person. We think we're talking to a person, but it's more like talking to a ghost. We're using words and phrases and concepts, and we think it's the same thing, but when we lob it across the wall to someone else, it's not. It's totally different for them. And you see that all the time, of course, when you talk to conservatives and liberals, right? Another sort of way that pragmatism falls out, is that you can begin to be a little bit more radical about how you talk about differences between people. And I think one really primary, wonderful example of this is John Haidt's work on morality, where he's basically saying, look, I've just done some basic research and I've discovered that conservatives have 5 different moralities that they use, and liberals have 2 modalities, you know, and the work is very convincing and very powerful. But if you don't have a sort of public model, private model kind of approach, you can't get at that from a philosophy. If you understand basically that you're talking about a sort of strategic underpinning here, it gives that model a lot of strength, you know? You can begin to think about it from the ground up instead of kind of saying, yeah, this is a really strange fact. People are really different along this way, or maybe it's not. Maybe it can't be, and we have to just kind of work out why, you know. It's just great. I really love it. Now, there are some decent critiques of pragmatism. I want to talk about that for a moment because it's always important with philosophy. The people that complain, though, what they generally complain about with pragmatism is that it's not really workable. It's very complex. There's no way to sort of get any use out of it for the masses. It's not a philosophy that you can kind of spend your life on and then, you know, you die and you've done this massive great good for all of humanity. It's more like you're doing bits and pieces of work, like John Haidt's, for instance, to try and map out a very specific thing, in this case, Western civilization, conservatives versus liberals, you know, which doesn't do anybody a lot of good, like Keats, who wanted to make overarching pronouncements about human beings, you know. In fact, it's kind of contrary to that. Well, my response to that basic complaint is, you know, let's go take a look at the physicists. Let's see what they're doing with their life. Right now they're obsessed with quantum mechanics, all right? But if we go back almost 100 years now, 90 years or so, back when Niels Bohr started working on quantum mechanics, Einstein was totally annoyed with him. Now, Einstein at that time, about 100 years ago, had come up with a lot of the aspects of the general theory of relativity, a beautiful, elegant way of articulating the overarching facts about life, if you will, on the physical side. And when Niels Bohr just started basically, you know, science is a blackboard I write a bunch of goofy facts on, and then I make really random connections between these different particles and these different forces, all of which have nothing to do with each other. They have all these weird rules. Later, things like quantum chromodynamics came along, and, you know, just completely unique rules to that very, very specific part of physical science, and no overarching model in sight anywhere. And still, of course, you know, you and I are going to die, and almost certainly they won't have an overarching universal model of reality on the physical sciences side there. But they do have a lot of really interesting and theories, in other words, stuff that's proven about the way light works, for instance, the way mass works, the way certain types of mass work, the various fields that come in, and then these other sort of mythical particles that no one's ever seen, like gluons, you know, that have to exist, you know, and so they're beginning to really get a good tie on a lot of reality, but they're only doing it on an ad hoc basis. And now I'm looking from a philosophical standpoint, you know, dealing with abstractions and psychology, perception, all these very, very soft sciences. It makes complete sense to me that we would have at least as much difficulty with an overarching model as the physicists do. So for me, the notion of, oh, it's kind of half-assed, it doesn't really work very well over here, it may work over here, but, you know, that's not really a criticism. To me, that's just sort of saying, yeah, unfortunately, that's where we're at with the science. We just have to get down into the detail, you know. And it's one of the reasons why I do a lot of qualitative research, meaning that I sit down with Joe, make sure he's comfortable, and then just kind of talk to him. And the reason why I do that is because I'm very much into his private model. And I've found that there's an enormous amount of power and some applicability with other private models and some public models if I do that. So that's pragmatism. The next video has to do with irony. Thanks.